Format's about to take a heavy shift with crossover breakers coming out, so let's take a look at it. Hey guys, Otaku here, back with another competitive Yu-Gi-Oh video. So today we're doing yet another tier list on the upcoming format with crossover breakers. Normally these deck building sets don't bring like a huge shift in the format. The last few like meta contending decks that came out of these deck building sets was like Vanquish Soul and the Centurions, and both decks have seen their time in the limelight, sure, but recently haven't been doing a whole lot. Like Centurion's probably the more topical one at the moment, but Malice and Ryzeal are going to bring a huge shift to the meta, and it's time to talk about that. But before we do jump on into the tier list, I have noticed that a great deal of you that watch my content are not subscribed to the channel. And so if you like competitive Yu-Gi-Oh content and you want to see more videos like this one, then consider subscribing to the channel, hitting that bell button for future notifications when I upload, but also like the video. But with that, let's jump on in. All right, so there's not a lot of decks I want to talk about today, mainly because other than the obvious contenders, we don't fully know what's going to be meta in the upcoming format until we officially start getting some YCSs and some regionals to see who's topping. So with the inclusion of Malice and Ryzeal, we just have decks that have been topping or some decks that I want to theorize about for the upcoming format. And the first two decks I want to talk about are obviously the two biggest contenders, Malice and Ryzeal. We don't care about the third archetype, I don't even remember what they're called. We don't care about them because they're not going to do a whole lot. It's a cool archetype, but I don't think it's going to do anything. Let's talk about Malice. Malice is the deck of my choice. I think it's going to be a really cool deck. I also, in my personal opinion, and also the opinion of a lot of other TCG players, this is going to be the top dog in the upcoming format, whereas Ryzeal will be a very close second place contender. The reason for this is I just think, one, different play styles. The TCG has been more known to play for combo decks, but we also are prone for breaking decks, and Malice is a deck that has already been like, I wouldn't say solved by any means, but we have already started finding ways to break this deck, and we have started finding ways to counter out Ryzeal in a very impactful way. Malice is insane, one, because it is a shifter deck that heavily benefits from shifter, and those kind of decks are always the worst kind of decks. I mean, look at Flu, for example, or Kashtira. Those decks were never fun when they were in the format. But on top of that, Malice has this crazy grind game, and because of the way the deck works, it plays through or even just around very just popular hand traps. Like Ash Blossom and Droll don't really do anything to this deck. In fact, there's very few interaction where Ash even can interact with the deck at all, because the deck banishes. It doesn't send the deck special summons from the banish pile in the graveyard. It doesn't special summon from the deck. So like Ash doesn't do a whole lot against this deck. And Droll, the deck in of itself, its in-engine doesn't really add. It has a lot of drawing spells, but in an essence, the deck itself doesn't really add cards, so it can play around Droll pretty well as well. Where this deck gets hurt a little bit more is that since it's a link deck, it needs the bodies on the board, meaning that any sort of interaction that would get those bodies off the board, like Nibiru or a popping effect, can hurt, but they can even play around Nibiru in a very impactful way as well. Target negation hurts this deck quite a bit, but as I've mentioned in my previous video, there is ways to also play around that. But as I also just mentioned, this deck has a very, very good grind game. Like, the recursion is insane because we have so many ways that despite we only play one of each of the Malice Link monsters, we have ways of banishing them from the graveyard, bringing them back, and then recurring our resources as if nothing happened. And on top of that, every time, you banish the Link monsters like the Hearts of Cryptor, it's going to come back with 5k attack, and it's going to just beat into you. This card is insane. So I just think Malice will be the top dog, but Ryzeal will be a good close second. And the reason being is that this deck does a lot with essentially nothing. Ryzeal's end board is pretty much they end on Detonator plus the field spell and then like a couple hand traps in hand. And that's really all it needs because the deck plays like 20 plus hand traps. And the field spell is a non-activated negate that just detaches from an Xyz monster. So you can choose what monster effect to negate off of the field spell and just completely destroy a chain. Like, the chain blocking is just not a thing with the field spell on board. And then Detonator, yes, is easier to play around than a lot of people expected because it is a response effect. So you can just summon out like Access Code Talker off of Malice and then get it off the board without it ever being super relevant. So there is ways to play around the deck, but I think Ryzeal is still a very, very strong deck. It's very scary. That field spell is very intimidating. And if they open too much hand traps, then they're just off to the races. This deck does die to too many forms of interruption, though. Droll and Lockbird hurts the deck a lot. Doesn't kill it, but it hurts the deck a lot. But also Droll plus another hand trap almost just instantly digs the grave for the deck. So deck can do a lot with nothing, though. They just special one body, and all of a sudden they have like 5 bodies on board, and you have no clue where they came from. Next is every other deck that's been topping as of recently, or every other recent like relevant deck, or even a couple decks in here that I want to talk about because the possible relevancy of them. Branded, I think, is gonna kind of struggle in this upcoming format. Just Gimmick Puppet Lock isn't doing much as of late. The deck can play under Shifter. It doesn't like playing under Shifter. Also, just, I don't know. I just don't think Branded is going to be the play in the upcoming format. I didn't even talk about like the tiers here. We have top dog, which is going to be Malice and Ryzeal. Nothing else is going to be up there minus one other deck. Second place is going to be decks that can top and just kind of put up a good fight. Struggle Bus is going to be rogue decks that will still top, but they have to have a good pilot behind them. And then Just Don't is going to be decks that just don't play them. Just save yourself some time and don't play them. Branded, like I said, though, I think is going to be a rogue strategy. I think this deck is still relevant. One Branded Fusion on the last ban list didn't do anything. This deck still performs just fine. Plays around all the hand traps. Doesn't really matter. Shifter, it can play into. It doesn't like to do it. It shuts off a lot of the deck's like major interaction, like Granganol and Mirror Jade, obviously. So, and Shifter is going to be very popular in the upcoming format if they don't hit it on the next ban list, which hope to God they do. I hate that card, even though I'm about to be playing Malice, because mainly Malice is going to be siding it. Ryzeal can side it because they can play through it just fine. Like, there's no issue with Shifter in the upcoming format. So any deck that can't play under it probably just won't contend in the upcoming format. Centurion, I think, is going to be still a very good contender. It's going to do what it already does. It plays through very specific hand traps. It's probably one of the best decks playing under the Mulch Army, which is something that we need to be looking at when we're talking about these decks as well, is that under the Fualos, it can play under it very well because most likely they're only giving you one draw under Fualos and still setting up a very significant board. Cosmic Blazar is still a very incredibly powerful card. And the grind game on Centurion is pretty good. So Centurion, I think, is going to still be a very relevant deck in the upcoming format. Chimera, one of my all-time favorite decks of all time, if not my all-time favorite deck of all time. I absolutely love this deck with a passion. As you all know, most of you are here on my channel because you found me through one of my many Chimera deck videos. So Chimera, Fiendsmith, Azamina, or just Chimera in general, they're all the Chimera builds are going to be in the same tier for here. It's going to be a struggle bus. I hate to say it. I know all of my Chimera believers here in the chat. It's going to be a struggle. The one saving grace here is that in the OCG, Chimera is actually putting up results. And the main reason is because Shifter, I believe, is semi-limited and also just less popular over in the OCG. But Chimera can still do things, but if Shifter has been activated, they don't play the game. Many people in here, and any Chimera player that's here in the comments saying like, yeah, no, we can play under Shifter, I just make this, this, and this. It's not a relevant board. I promise you, it's not a relevant board. But also on top of that, we don't do very well under Mulch Army. Like, I know some pro players have said like, oh, Chimera can do well under Mulch Army because they set up like Chimera, which will do a hand rip, which will just rip the card that they drew, and then you set like the Chimera Fusion that you just added back, and then you have Codal and Sword Knight and Graveyard, which is negate interaction. That's really not enough in any format. Not in the current format, definitely not in the next format. It's just not enough. So the deck can't play under Shifter. It can play okay under Mulch Army Fualos, but not well enough. So the upside with Chimera is like, there are some weird boards that you can make that you can just play into the Fualos, and if you open like Thrust, and you can search like Heavy Slump or something, but like you can do that in almost any deck. So it's like, I think Chimera is just going to be a struggle bus in the upcoming format. It's gonna be a rogue strategy, probably one of the best rogue strategies that you can be doing, but you know what you're signing up for essentially. Flu's on here. We're not going to talk about Flu just yet. We're going to talk about Snake Eye. I have Fiendsmith, Snake Eye, Azamina on here, but it could also just be Snake Eye, Azamina, because I know like if you play Impulse, you're probably not playing the Fiendsmith package. So Like this is just Snake Eye, and then we have Fire King Snake Eye, of course. Snake Eye and Fire King Snake Eye, I think, are still going to be very powerful decks. But as we saw at YCS Bologna, even though it was like the most represented deck in top 32, it didn't make it at all into top 8, which was the most refreshing thing to see, might I add. Not seeing Snake Eye in top 8 was really nice to see. Snake Eye is just very slowly falling out of favor. And when we have 2 decks that can play Shifter in the upcoming format, it's going to fall even more out of favor. The Fire King build, in my opinion, is still one of the better builds because it can play under the Molch Army a lot better than the Fiendsmith version or the Azamina version, but not as well as like some other decks like Centurion. The Snake Eyes in general, like the hits that it got on the last list were a lot more impactful than we had thought they would be. They just kind of removed this deck's grind game. Not entirely. The Fire King deck still has a really good grind game, but like the pure version, it hurts. If you can't get those resources back out the graveyard, it definitely hurts. And I just think that Snake Eyes is not going to be able to keep up with Malice and Ryzeal's grind game like at all. Next, we're going to talk about Kashtira. So Joshua Schmidt and Pack both topped at YCS Bologna, I believe, and they played Kashtira Fiendsmith, which was a very control-style deck, and it was really cool. It was really cool to watch. And Kashtira, I think, does have like a weird place in this upcoming format. With Shifter running around a lot more, it definitely has a place. Kashtira's can play under the Molch Army Fool Loss really well because they don't have to go into their Xyz monsters, but also Kashtira can be an engine to facilitate other decks like Malice. So I think like Kashtira is a very good contender. Maybe like bottom of second place, like, and then borderline rogue, because Kashtira is still Kashtira. It does what it does. It has the tendency to brick. It's not super consistent as it used to be. So I think like depending on how you play it or what you play it in, Kashtira still has a place in the upcoming format. Labyrinth I had in here because like Labyrinth's still one of those weird decks that just somehow keeps topping despite the fact that like it hasn't changed its strategy in well over a year. And so I'm just going to put it in Rogue. I think like it's still a okay deck and it still has the ability to top if it has the right pilot, but I don't know. I just, again, I don't know how this deck keeps doing things when we all know what it's trying to do. Too many hand traps just stops it in its tracks, which the upcoming format is going to be littered with hand traps. The only like super plus side to Labyrinth is that it can just 100% play under Fool Loss. It does not care about Fool Loss at all. It's like, oh, I activate Fool Loss. All right, cool. Set 5 pass. So it's like it can play under the Charmies just fine. The Melodious deck, I don't really know. It does cool things, but if I remember correctly, Melodious banishes, or maybe they bounce to hand, they banish their own cards. I don't remember what this deck entirely does. I know the engine is strong, but other than that, I don't fully know what this deck does. I have to kind of put it in Rogue. I don't think it is going to be good enough to contend with a lot of the upcoming format. Just its grind game is good. It has a really good grind game. I know that much. But if you're a Melodious player, please feel free to enlighten me on your thoughts. Another deck that topped in the most recent YCS is the Mermail Atlantean deck. This deck's kind of crazy. This deck scares me. 2 people at my locals play this deck, and I dread playing them every time they're playing this deck because it does really good stuff. The issue with this deck is it does cripple under the right hand traps. Like Shifter hurts a lot. Too much like target negation or like an Ash Blossom plus like a Droll and Lockbird. The Droll hurts this deck a lot, but like Droll and Lockbird plus a second hand trap hurts this deck a lot. So too much just interaction can hurt this deck in very meaningful ways. But like the fact this deck can just hand rip you essentially for like your whole hand. It can set up the Water Barrier statue on turn 1, so you just can't play around it. This deck does cool stuff, and because of that, like, despite Shifter running around, also it can't play under Molch Army like at all. So it's like because Shifter is going to be running around and Molch Army is still going to be running around, like I kind of want to put this deck still in a good spot. I think it'll be a good contender. It does really interesting things, but with all these hand traps running around, it's going to be having an issue. So actually, I'm going to put it top of Struggle Bus. This is like less of a rogue sort of scenario and more of just like it's going to put up results, but it needs to see some luck. Memento can't play under Shifter, and it actually can play under Molch Army just fine. If they're playing the Fiendsmith package, they just won't play the Fiendsmith package, but the deck still puts up results, as we saw at YCS Bologna. This is just a deck that, like, everyone kind of keeps forgetting exists. Like, when we prep for decks, we're not really, at least I wasn't, we're not really prepping for this deck, because a lot of what we're trying to counter kind of crosses over into this deck a little bit. But Memento, still a very strong deck, a very, really good recursion, actually. And then also the ability to just end on like a 5 negates plus like hand traps and some popping effects. Like, this deck is still very strong. Pearly, you won't really be struggling. Honestly, it hurts me, but I kind of want to say just don't play Pearly. Pearly can play under Shifter. I'll give it credit where credit's due. Pearly can play under Shifter. For the longest time, we were siding Shifter. But there's very little to no interaction with the graveyard with the top decks in the upcoming format. Like, Ryzeal can pull from their banish pile. Malice exclusively pulls from the banish pile, minus like Splash Mage or Transcode Talker. And there's a lot of like, there's just a 5 Material Noir is just not going to cut it anymore, unfortunately. And also, there is a good chance, because of Ryzeal, Pearly will pay for Ryzeal's sins. Xyz Encore is in the talks of being used again to counter out the Ryzeal deck. And if that happens, then Pearly just naturally is going to get hit in the crossfire. So I kind of want to say just don't play Pearly. Rescue Ace, it's kind of in the same boat as like Snake Eye. It just kind of does the same shit as like Snake Eye. Like, you see the Sinful Spoils package in Rescue Ace. Rescue Ace plays really well under Mulch Army, funny enough. It does not play very well under the Dimension Shifter, and it has a pretty good grind game. Like, the trap, like the set 4 pass off of Turbulence is just, it's kind of enough, honestly. So it's like pretty good contender still. Plants, I don't know. I'm just putting it in just don't. Just stop playing plants, please, for the love of God. I don't know. Despite the fact that I played against plants a couple of times, I don't know what this deck does, like, at all. It sets up, I think, like 2 negates and then like some like other interaction. But other than that, I don't know what plants does. Ritual Beasts. This is an interesting deck because not only can it play under Shifter, it actually likes playing under Shifter, just like Malice. If they summon out Protoss and just call Dark, then Malice can't play at all. If they summon out Protoss and call Light, Ryzeal can't really play at all. They can make some other rank force, but they can't special summon Lights, and like, I'm pretty sure that's all of their main deck monsters. So it's like, Protoss hurts both the top contending decks, and because of that, I think I still gotta put like I still gotta put Ritual Beast in like the top placing, because Protoss hurts both decks significantly. Stun, I feel like just has fallen out. Like, we see less runic stun or just stun in general as time goes on, and I think that's because stun is a deck that people will play when it's not being respected, and we've gotten to a point where we're respecting it. Like, we go to YCSs and regionals expecting to see at least one stun player, and sure enough, we see that one stun player. So again, we're respecting it. It's less effective. Just a lot of the decks currently just can play around it and not care. We have a lot of popping, like Fire King, just pop any card on the board with Kieran. Like, we don't care. Skill Drain hurts, but it's a one-of, and if they don't see Skill Drain, if they don't want to see many of their random floodgates, then they just don't play. So, again, just don't play stun, honestly. Salad, don't play Salad. Funny enough, I just went to a regional like a couple weeks ago, and I got cooked by Salad, but I still have to say don't play Salad. If you're going to play a fire deck, play one of the many that are in the second place category, but I just feel like Salad just ain't it. Also, Salad doesn't play under Shifter at all. It doesn't play under Mulch Army at all. So it's like, these are things you have to consider when you're going to be playing a deck in the upcoming formats. Does it play under Shifter? Does it play under Mulch Army? These are very popular hand traps that are going to be seen. The next deck we want to talk about is the one that I hate the most. I hate this deck so much, and that is Tenpai. Tenpai is our number 3 spot. Tenpai is just a deck that until they hit the right card, they ban a card like fucking Pydra or something. I'm not saying they should ban Pydra, I'm just giving an example. But if they have to ban the right card in this deck, because this deck is just so strong. Like, yeah, they only have 1 prosperity. They only have 1 field spell, but they have 1,000 ways to find that field spell. They have 1,000 ways to play without it. And they have a bajillion fucking board breakers. They have Raigeki, they have Lightning Storm, they have Harpy's Feather Duster, they have Cosmic Cyclone if they choose to run it. This deck is just really annoying, and it wants to go first. The funny thing here is, though, is that Malice can make terahertz, and terahertz, funny enough, is like the anti-Tenpai. If Tenpai doesn't open a board breaker card, they just can't kill terahertz because it negates, or it prevents your opponent from activating effects in the battle phase, which means Tenpai just can't play under it. Obviously, they could just make Black Rose. If they have combo, they make Black Rose, and then they just pop the terahertz or something like that. So it's like not an end-all be-all. But there are... this deck is still going to be like one of the most powerful and annoying decks in the upcoming format. D-Bear is going to hurt this deck a lot, which will be run thanks to Ryzeal being in the format. So there are ways to play around this deck still. Next is Voiceless. Voiceless keeps like randomly topping at times. It's a cool deck and it's capable of doing cool things. The problem is that I just feel like this deck keeps getting power crept. It can't play under Shifter. It can play well under Mole Charm because it doesn't really need to touch its extra deck. So there's like cool things to do with this deck. I've seen like Voiceless Voice Nadir Servant or like Voiceless Voice Dogmatica. Like there's some cool stuff this deck can do. But because of that, I feel like it's a rogue strategy because it sets up really good turn 1 boards, but it doesn't do shit going second. It just can't compete going second. And if it gets put up against Malice or Ryzeal, it's just going to crumble. The issue with this deck is like you go against Ryzeal, you go like Blessing, and they just go, no, I go Detonator Pop, or you go Barrier, Detonator Pop, you go Low, Detonator Pop, like, and then, or you just go Field Spell and negate the Low. The Field Spell for Ryzeal is going to hurt Voiceless a lot. Malice just banish the Low. Get rid of the Low and they can't play. Simple as that. Next is like White Forest. I think White Forest is going to take a bit of a back seat in the upcoming format. Now, White Forest will get a lot of cool support in Supreme Darkness, but I think for the upcoming format, just don't right now. Like I have White Forest Runic here, but this could be any version of White Forest. It doesn't have to be the Runic version. I think White Forest kind of just doesn't have what it needs right now. It has like the bones, the foundation, but it needs the meat, you know, and the good stuff is coming in Supreme Darkness, but that is January, not December format. So for now, I think don't play White Forest, but keep your stuff because it's going to be pretty powerful in January. Second to last deck is going to be Yubel. I think Yubel's still fine. Like Yubel can't play under Molcharmy. It can't play under Shifter, and Shifter's going to be very powerful because the top 3 decks can play Shifter, one of which will probably just main deck it. Well, maybe not, because like if you go against Malice, then you're just letting them plus. But so it can't play under those 2 very popular hand traps in the upcoming format, but it still sets up really crazy turn 1 boards. But the problem is that the Malice deck can banish, which means they're not getting their Yubel effects. Now, Ryzeal, Detonator, you're going to have to be smart with Detonator against Yubel. Like, you go Phantom Night or Phantom Pain or Nightmare Pain, you just go Detonator, get rid of that. Like, no, get it out of here. But the rest of the deck, like, it's rough because, like, if you just end on fucking Detonator and they just put 3 bodies on board, oh, you're going to feel it. The last deck I want to talk about is a kind of theory deck. So, as I mentioned, I feel like Malice is going to be one of the top dogs in the upcoming format. And the last time we had a very link-focused deck in the like top contender spot was Unchained. You could argue the Snake Eye deck was a link-focused deck, and you're not entirely wrong, but I'm more looking towards Unchained. And in Unchained format, we saw a massive rise in Flu. And that's because the entire deck of Unchained revolved around their Link monsters, Yama. So if you ended on an M-Pen, they're not playing. But then also on top of that, Flu plays under Shifter just fine. They main deck Shifter. They don't care. And so it's like they have strategies to play around this stuff. So they probably have a good matchup into Malice. Now the issue here is they might not have the greatest matchup against the Ryzeal. The field spell hurts a lot, and the field spell can choose what to negate and when, and it's not an activated response effect. It just happens. So they can just interrupt your Robina regardless of if you chain block it. So like the matchup there is terrible, but Flu can do some stuff against Malice. So I think because of that, right now I'm going to put it in Struggle Bus, but like I feel like there's a good chance Flu could see some major love, some major representation in the upcoming format. So just kind of keep it in your sights, because this deck still, it's essentially at full power. It's got Shifter, it can play Molch Army, kind of, it can search it, it can play the Harpy's Featherstorm still. It has like options, so just kind of keep it on your radar. But that's really all I have for you guys today. Again, I wanted to talk about really just the decks that have been topping for the most part, or like showing results in some manner, or more like recent topical decks. But the main attraction here was, of course, Malice and Ryzeal, and how these decks are going to compete against those two decks entirely, but also who can play under Shifter, who can play under Molch Army. So there may be other decks that aren't on this list that rise to the occasion because they can play under those hand traps, and they can play all these other hand traps. So yes, is a good possibility that a deck that needs to be talked about is not on here. I apologize, but comment down below maybe if I missed a deck. But also, don't forget to leave a like on this video. Also, subscribe to the channel if you're not already and you like competitive Yu-Gi-Oh content. But with that, I'll see you all in the next video. See ya.